I've tried to have this conversation with other people. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are afraid of, like exploring just ideas that might seem ridiculous and like saying something stupid out loud and then just being like, yeah, no, that was dumb. That was a dumb thing to say.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the inherent value?
Yeah. It's the reticence to discuss it. I share, and it's a good reticence because it can be triggering, I think, for folks who have experienced, all kinds of traumas or mental health crises or whatever else. And, the sort of main line for responding therapeutically to that kind of trauma or experience has been to sort of reify this notion, I would argue, to reify this notion that like, life and individual lives are inherently meaningful.
Welcome to a conversation with Professor of Sociology at the George Washington University, Dr. Desmond Goss. Professor Goss is an expert sociologist on matters relating to religion, gender ideology, and social justice. During our nearly 2-hour-long conversation, we start by discussing what it means to be a sociologist and quickly pivot to interesting yet controversial topics such as the value of life, existential anxiety and metaphysical guilt, and even ask questions on God and death. I had the privilege of taking a course taught by Professor Goss last semester, and it was one of the most interesting experiences I've had. I didn't always agree with what was being said during lectures, but I always came to understand where the person or people who were behind this perspective were coming from. Dr. Goss is a great speaker who is extremely knowledgeable, charismatic, and witty. Sociological conversations like this one have helped me challenge perspectives that I have and change notions on ideas that I held before. I hope you enjoy this conversation and listen to it with an open mind and grow interest in the field of sociology.
The first thing that I wanted to talk about was the field of sociology broadly. My first question for you was, what do you think it takes to be a sociologist?
Well, there's two answers.
Shoot.
The first answer is the two answers are separated by what one could call themselves and then what, in my opinion, I think is good sociology. So, so to give an answer to the first place, I think it was Ronald Reagan who majored in sociology. And the Moynihan Report was completed by a sociologist. So, in that practical, institutionalized sense, it just requires a degree, perhaps, maybe. On the other hand, of what I would consider good sociology, which certainly does not require a degree. And I think certain modes of sociology, Marxist sociology, Black feminist sociology, et cetera, are more apt to recognize that a degree is not required to do good sociology, that there are people doing it every day who don't even know the word necessarily. But it requires, perhaps more than anything, the ability to critique. And that is important because so much of our social realities are sort of prefabulated, and we just sort of fall into them, and that falling is very comfortable. So being able to step out of that and be critical of not just the world around you, but your position in it is such a skill and is the cornerstone, I think, to a good contemporary sociology. And then to be able, with that, I think attached to that critique is this notion that I'm not the only person here. I'm not the main character of this reality, right? I am one of many different pieces, some of them millennia old, and understanding that relationship to other people, that sense of community, for better or worse, is really key. So I think one, having a sense of an ability to critique, especially those things you feel really comfortable with. And then two, being able to recognize, what we call the sociological imagination, that you're not the only person here. Your particular reality is intimately connected to the realities of everybody else. And that's really significant.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I was having the other day with a friend who would always talk about how travel kind of gives you this insight into other people's experiences that really opens, I guess, an eye into being able to kind of see that perspective, that you're not the only one, that it's not just your opinion, especially when you're traveling to a place that isn't, like your home environment, that is significantly different, that has a different way of going about things. So what do you think is the best way to kind of get started on that process of being able to understand that you're not the only person here?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the easiest way, I don't know if it's the best, but the easiest way is to probably crack open a book. I mean, and I say that for accessibility. I mean, travel is great, but super, super inaccessible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
For lots and lots of people. But libraries are generally right around the corner and free. And I think a lot of the ways for me that I came to a kind of sociological, mindset was as a kid reading things that were very different from my own experience. And for me, that was a lot of horror. So I loved Goosebumps, for example. And, it was so different,
Yeah.
obviously from my own personal experience, but it was being able to sort of empathize with the experience of someone else. Um, I just think the simplest way to do that is through reading. And I just happen to have a love of reading, and that was my first way into it. But, I think there are other ways. I think travel doesn't necessarily have to involve, leaving the country. I think even just, recently I moved, from Georgia, as you know, and living in Atlanta versus experiencing some of the areas outside of Atlanta can feel like being in a foreign country and getting that sense, and I should note here that, I didn't always feel safe doing so, for sure. So I wouldn't necessarily say people need to subject themselves to unsafe environments to have the feeling, but just being able to, I think in these kinds of cases, it's probably particularly important for folks who have the power and privilege to shape, socio-political discourses, to step outside of that into I want to say into the light, but into other spaces where that kind of power and privilege is less or reduced or prohibited. So like being able to go into a neighborhood in which you've never stepped into before, and it just like having the experience of what it means to be able, for example, to only get vegetables and fruits from a small corner store, and or a Piggly Wiggly or a Food Lion, and then being able to translate that sense, that experience, into broader critiques about like food deserts or critiques about obesity. And that helps to get you away from like, oh, well, people who are fat are just lazy, towards this more structural social political understanding. Well, actually, like it's difficult to eat well when you work a night shift, for example, and your local grocer has like bananas and apples and that's it, and they're very expensive and probably not great. And or you can just step right over to Burger King every day, grab something really quick, way cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. So just in any regard, being able to have the experience of someone else, knowing that you'll never fully understand. You don't want to appropriate, but being able to have this sense of like, okay, I can understand these the lives of these folks, the experiences, the perspectives of them, and then translating that back into your own life. Like, oh, this is just me and that's them. These relations are connected, but I can't make assumptions about their livelihoods, their failures, their successes, et cetera. All of that is in some way, if not wholly, tied back to the structures in which we are embedded, that we largely have very little control over.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot to touch on there. And there was a section that I wanted to get to about like mental health and combining, speaking about mental health and sociology and the social justice advocacy component of that. But before getting there, it's very interesting. I've discovered, trying to understand the field of sociology, how almost every component of it is, or almost every component of life is sociological. I was reading, Aristotle getting into college, and one thing that Aristotle says, and I'm sure you'd love this, is that man is a political animal. And that really got me thinking how that relates to sociology. Do you think that we're sociological animals, that we're sociological creatures? Do you think that it's, how would you characterize that? Because politics, I feel like everyone always thinks super easy, like, oh, okay, it's just like, it's that thing, it's the politics. What does it actually mean to be a sociological animal?
Sure. Well, I think I have to open here first with a critique of Aristotle. And, I think the easiest way is to first let me step on his cis-patriarchal use of man as encompassing of everyone. That one's the easy one.
Yeah.
I think from what I know of Aristotle, that for him, I think that was more about conflict and rivalry and understanding politics as like this inherently factionalized, warring kind of zeitgeist that for folks like Aristotle and a lot of those, preeminent, scholars of that time naturally existed, right? I mean, they were all about this understanding of like trying to understand like human relationships as governed by natural kinds of laws, right? So that makes it complicated because in the first sense, there's a yes and a no here, which is the basic sociological answer to everything. But the yes part is, yeah, sure. I mean, human societies are interpolated by certain kinds of social realities that we could describe as political, right? There's some means, there's some ends, there's some goals, objectives that are generally shared by certain communities that may at times conflict with others. Now, the sort of medicine to that sugar is that it doesn't mean that conflict and warring factions must exist, right? So I think what folks like Aristotle sort of like zoom over is the production of these conflicts and warring factions. I think they stepped outside, they saw people fighting and were like, oh, this is how things are always and therefore are supposed to be. Instead of, and they, to their credit, they didn't have the same anthropological, archaeological evidence that we do today to suggest that like that's not how it has to be, right? And then in fact, looking at that kind of evidence, we can see, and even just today, we can see lots of cooperation. And the idea that, competitiveness versus cooperation, that former is somehow more important than the other, I think is just a kind of capitalist, cis heteropatriarchal kind of indoctrination that we get sort of we grow into, we get socialized into. We could have a world in which cooperation was the end all be all. So yeah, people are sociological animals in a basic sense. I mean, we are a collaborative species. It would appear through time. I think that just, in a lot of ways, that just has something to do with, outside of my realm of expertise, but the ways in which, giving that evolution produces a sense of very little bit of offspring. It's like really, really important, right? If you're producing like thousands and thousands of babies, then like a turtle, you just like have at it. Maybe some of them maybe some no, but if you're producing like one or two, and that production is so stressing to the birthing parent, it makes sense to cooperate, right? To do everything in your power to make sure that offspring is successful. Now, that does not mean, on the other side of that everything we do is governed by this sort of evolutionary biology, right? I don't know why we have to take it to that extreme. There are moments where mammals, including humans, abandon their children, right? I mean, so it's not this law that pre-exists us, right? There are ways in which we also have to be socialized to understanding that kind of that maintenance, that production of parenthood or whatever else is a good thing. So I would say we are socio-political beings, I think is maybe a less problematic way to say it. We are a collaborative species. We are a species that has a means and an ends, and even Marx recognized that, right? I mean that we're destined for resource extraction and use for our own survival. Now, again, to critique Marx, you have to be socialized into the idea that survival is a good thing, right? I would agree with that at base, although I think it requires some nuance.
Yeah, that's something that I wanted to touch on too. I feel like something that's interesting always about these conversations is that maybe some of the most thought-provoking things are said and then just completely glossed over. And one thing you just said right now was like that's even to say if survival is something that is like inherently good or something along those lines. And that's a topic that I think we've touched on before, but something that I'd really like to discuss a little bit more in depth here, because I've tried to have this conversation with other people. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are afraid of, like exploring just ideas that might seem ridiculous and like saying something stupid out loud and then just being like, yeah, no, that was dumb. That was a dumb thing to say. So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the inherent value?
It's the reticence to discuss it. I share, and it's a good reticence because it can be triggering, I think, for folks who have experienced, all kinds of traumas or mental health crises or whatever else. And, the sort of main line for responding therapeutically to that kind of trauma or experience has been to sort of reify this notion, I would argue, that like, life and individual lives are inherently meaningful in whatever way. And rationally, that makes sense. If you're trying to get someone to understand, like, hey, you belong here among us, then it's a good sort of like baseline to harken back to reify that. Now, sociologically speaking, critically speaking, scientifically speaking, it would be difficult to prove, right?
Yeah.
So, it's a leap of faith. It's difficult to prove that the survival of the human species is a necessity. You just can't. I mean, I have not seen any cosmological, philosophical, sociological, religion, anything to be able to do that. Now, you can make certain proclamations that people will have to then just assume as true, and that's what I mean by the leap of faith. Like, we'll have to skip over the problematic of there being no scientific justification here and just accept it. But to say, oh, well, the human species needs to continue, why? What is the imperative for that continuation? And we don't have anything. So it's a difficult conversation because it is the framework around which like everything we do is embedded. So I think I think the fear is that it can move us to a kind of fatalism or nihilism, where like nothing means anything, and it's just life is just one long Nietzschean, idiom. But, I counter that with the fact that like that's also not very interesting. Like you don't necessarily have to understand why, I don't know, coffee tastes so good to enjoy it. Right? Like most of us have no idea. You don't need to understand the biological dynamics of like the scent of, I don't know, lilac, for example, to enjoy the smell of lilac, right?
Sure.
So, I think there's even really there's a freeing power in understanding that the notion that, humanity, there's no imperative for the survival of humanity. And I think that gets translated sociopolitically, right? If we think about some of the conversations around abortion or the conversations around physician-assisted suicides, where people are really fighting for what I would say is their individual rights to their health and their lives and their livelihoods. So much of that gets sort of like sort of suppressed through this idea where like life is precious, right? I mean, that's the underlying goal. And it's like, is it? Like, why is it? What makes it?
Yeah.
You can say it's rare. That's important.
Sure.
It's astronomically rare, but then you have to prove that rarity is important, right?
Sure.
Like what's significant about rarity. So, you make these leaps of faith. I think they just make life interesting. I don't think it's necessary for someone or life in general to feel significant to have to say why it is. Is that explaining?
No.
Okay.
That explained it very well. Okay. My first intuition is to like do the like Christian argument of well if you believe that like nothing matters, like why don't you just go out and kill everyone and like go do all these bad things? So for the sake of the conversation, I guess I just will ask that. Okay, yeah, if nothing does matter, why are we even sitting here talking about the fact that nothing
matters? And so here's the two ways in which I respond. First of all is that we don't have to link mattering with survival of humanity, right?
Yeah.
That's the first thing, right? And we do this all the time, right? Like if I look at like, if I ask someone like, what's your favorite song? And they say, I don't know, I guess something Taylor Swift probably in this time and age. But and I say, oh, why? Like, why do you listen to that song over and over, right?
Yeah.
They can respond in ways, and I'll say why, and they respond again, and I say why, and we'll get to a point at which there's no answer to the question why. That doesn't make their enjoying of the song any less significant, right? That's the first thing. The second thing I will say is that we can see life mattering all over, not mattering all over the place, right? If I'm talking to someone who's pulling from that Christian perspective, I guess I might go back to the Crusades, or we might talk about Timothy McVeigh, or some of the ways in which currently now we're talking about prioritizing embryos, fetuses, even blastocysts and gametes over, women's health and survival, or birthing people's health and survival. So I would say we constantly pick and choose whose life matters and in what context, and this does not change that at all. So we're already operating under this broader theistic kind of mainframe of like life matters, and if it doesn't matter, then everything is nothing. And that has not translated into everybody's lives mattering, right? By definition. Wars, genocide, famine, you name it. So that mainframe as a place of action is already a problem. So I'm not doing anything to that. But what happens if we say, okay, maybe we don't need to connect life mattering to the idea that people should be able to survive and thrive, right? What happens if we flip that script? Maybe we get to places where we have less war and less famine and less genocide, right? I mean, maybe we get to places where we understand that, okay, I'm just going to believe that I would like for you to be here on this planet, right?
Yeah.
And that you have something to offer that can make our shared social realities more enjoyable, more interesting, more just, if that's your thing, or whatever. And that for me is a far more powerful motivator for action than some like, hanging participle, like very illusory kind of idea of like life matters for some reason, somewhere, somehow. But yeah, I hear you. That's the common refrain.
Yeah. I feel like that notion also it's almost paradoxical. I think is the word that I want to look for here, where it's almost like you can understand that concept that nothing has inherent value, that value is ascribed to things, and still find yourself experiencing these physiological reactions to certain stimulus. And one of those areas I think that is particularly true for, again, I could be wrong, you can correct me here, for sociologists, is this notion of a metaphysical guilt, where you almost feel a guilt for things that are going on in the world, even though you don't have a direct involvement or you could do anything to stop them, but you feel almost an innate human, I don't, innate, it's a tough word there, but an innate human, response to seeing suffering. Do you think that that's something that sociologists are more inclined to, or do you think that it's something that people that deal with this subject matter are more inclined to? Because I feel like, at least day to day, you have people that are covering and dealing and doing and watching the most egregious things, and at least on face, from what I can see, they don't seem necessarily affected or conflicted. You have people that are trying to solve hunger, and you see them on ads like smiling and like very happy about the fact that they're solving hunger. Donate to
Sure.
donate to my thing. Like, we're so good. But
Sure.
if I sit on reflect on ways to solve things that you've mentioned, houselessness, um, obesity, whatever phobia you want to try to talk about, it's very, very exhausting.
Yeah.
Is that a sociologist thing? Is that a people thing? Is that a what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it is exhausting. I think it's exhausting because it's so prevalent. Um, I mean, okay, so I mean, we just talked about like not being little nihilistic and fatalistic, and just that's the first place I was moving. But it's exhausting in my view because so much of our shared social reality is oppressive. And there's this ambient anxiety, I think, among us that in some ways is transformed into that sort of metaphysical guilt you're talking about. Because at the same time that all of this oppression and repression and uncertainty and death and risk, et cetera, and violence is happening, we're also like making a cute TikTok about whatever, and the TikTok gets 1 billion views, and we're also like, concerned about the newest iPhone or the latest Jordans or whatever. I'm going capitalistic, but that's not necessarily the only way in which this works. But there's this conflicting. I think that's especially for folks who are in poor countries, wealthy countries, where like the U.S., where you're seeing lots of the benefit of capitalism or cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, like you're seeing a lot of the benefits of that. And
Sure.
then on the split screen, you're seeing where it's coming from, right? So you're seeing the war in Iraq, for example, but you're also seeing lower gas prices because we just got a whole bunch more oil. So it's that existential anxiety is reasonable. It makes sense to me. And it is sociological, right? It's about the way in which we're socialized to understand our social realities. I think that metaphysical guilt is, well, first, I think that guilt is not a very useful emotion. I mean, I think it's an emotion that is, it doesn't have a lot of power. I mean, to feel guilty about something, it's like, well, remember like a couple of years ago when like white guilt was a kind of trending term, and that was the kind of idea. It was like, I feel bad about this. It was like, well, I'm not sure that's very useful. Do something, like actually do it, like something, whatever it may be. So, yeah, I think it makes sense to feel existentially burdened when so much of our world looks like it is crumbling. In a way it is, in a way it's always been in shambles for certain groups. I think new technologies, new communication technologies, being able to share more and more of what that looks and feels like means that certain power groups now are also able to see it and see the impacts of whatever it is that gave them power and privilege in the first place. So that makes sense. And it's very much a sociological phenomenon. And we don't always feel guilty about everything. And that's really the first thing, the first place that I would go with the sociology. Like in certain contexts, we feel guilty or we feel existential. It's funny to me that people like in your example of like, I like dogs because my partner used to work in the animal welfare industry, and the people and like they say, hey, this dog is it's going to be euthanized in the shelter. We need to get it out. Like people will come running. I mean, they will charter private planes and fly across the country to come pick up that dog, and then go home, walk downtown, pass someone asking for money in the street, roll their eyes, and call the cops on them. So it's not that compassion, that existential guilt. It isn't a blanket thing, right? The sociology of it, in a lot of ways, is really evident in who we allow it to, where and when we allow it to be impactful, and where and when it's completely absent.
Yeah. One of these places that we see a lot of new and unique, interesting, I don't know what the right descriptor here is for it, is the internet. You were mentioning it. And I think that that's something that's particularly interesting when you're talking about these oppressive structures and referring to ways of doing gender. There's been a lot of reports in these past couple years talking about how a lot of young girls, teenage girls, are having very negative thoughts and feelings about themselves, about their body, about their personality, about their position. And then on the other hand, you have studies that are showing that more boys are being diagnosed with ADHD than ever before, and more children are autistic than ever before. And you see people pointing their finger at social media. And I think that certainly that's something that we need to explore, the harms of it. I just think that it's particularly interesting because it's not like anything has substantively changed in terms of how the oppression is taking place. It's not like the internet came out and women started making even less money than that.
Sure.
Or it's not like the internet came out and the idea of what a woman should look like went from skinny to fat, and now the stress on women is that they have to put on all this weight. It seems like the thing that women are being forced into, and the ideas that men are being forced into, whether that be taking steroids now, something that I see is very popular in my generation, is something that was already prevalent within the structure itself.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we can't assign, I think, blanket characteristics to social media or the internet, right? I mean, it's a tool. It's a tool that's going to reflect the bottom line of wherever it is that it's emerging from. So yeah, I mean, there's no way that the internet would ever work in a way that is wholly justified or benevolent or useful if it's situated in, patriarchal systems, capitalist systems, et cetera. It's those things have to go first in a lot of ways for something like the internet or any, institutional mechanism or process or whatever to work in a way that's wholly beneficial. So I think, the internet has maybe made certain kinds of discourses more tenable, more attractive, more accessible, but not within itself created and I think every generation has a scapegoaty. I saw something the other day, and it was like this really old ad about, not an ad, but it was like this op-ed about telephones and the widespread use of telephones. It was like way back, like maybe the 60s or something. They were like, it's going to be the end of everything, society's in downfall. Here comes the telephone, and it's like, well, now we look back on that and it's kind of funny, right? I mean, it's kind of silly. So I think, I think in a lot of ways, people have we often have really tense relationships with new technologies. And social media is kind of new. And the more I think those technologies are quickly dissipated, like the internet, it's probably the more tense that relationship feels. When computers first came out, it was like, very few people were able to have them. They were so expensive. And then slowly they sort of crept up, right? And I think the tension there was really low, other than like Y2K, et cetera. But that was really about the internet, right? But when the internet came out, it's like everybody can have this thing very easily, and you just stick your AOL, showing my age, but stick your AOL, CD into the CD-ROM, and you can and you can do it really quick, right? And you get like 100, and I try to tell people, like younger folks, this all the time. It's like you could get on it for free because AOL would send you a CD like once a week, and they'd be like, 10 hours free, but you'd have like a stack of these bad boys, so. And honestly, those first days were like the Wild Wild West. Like if there was any point of time where things were just like do whatever you want and for better or worse, I mean, it was those first days of like chat rooms, et cetera. Now I would argue there's far more fail safes in place to check a lot of the violent things or the problematic things that may come out of social media or internet use than there were at those times. It was just like, hey, you're 10, hop on the internet and get into a chat room. I mean, the internet itself can't. It's a human production, right? It's going to reflect the humanity from which it's produced, for better or worse. So.
Yeah. This makes me think a lot of agency and the question of agency. You've written that agency is the deployment of power against an external opposing force. Thus, agency is power's kinesthetic state.
I wrote that?
You did. You did write that. You did.
Yeah, I don't remember that. Yeah.
What's your comment on this? Let's say you didn't write it. What do you think this person is? What do you think this person is saying here?
Oh, say it again.
Agency is the deployment of power against an external opposing force. Thus, agency is power's kinesthetic state.
Okay. So I think that person, who is probably me, is trying to sound smarter than they actually are. Using some big words.
Sure.
No, I think the bottom line of that is that, agency is the way in which we try to exert our influence over something, particularly when um, that influence feels especially unexertable, if that's a word.
Mm.
Um, but in general, my general sort of discussions and when I talk about agency and my research, et cetera, it's usually from a critical standpoint, in that I think even liberal and leftist factions in sociology, in politics, et cetera, overstate the I don't want to say the power of agency, because that's a little reductive, but overstate the how consequential
Mm.
individual agency is in particular. So I think there's this way in which neoliberal sociopolitics have influenced broader understandings of ourselves, of politics in general, in which we get really situated on what an individual can or will do. And that complicates the question of change and transformation in ways I think that we often are disengaged from. So, I like to say that, agency is great, but it's always operating under structural constraints. Um, so something like our general notion of free will doesn't
Yeah.
really exist. We can talk about free will as it works, as it operates in terms of options that we've been offered by our structures. Like you can choose this or that, but this X, Y thing that you can't even think about is not an option, right?
Mhm.
So, agency is good. I think agency's real power lies in community. Um, that there is this exponential increase in the consequences of agency when people are linked together. What can we do as an individual to make, whatever kind of change we want to see? For most of us, unless we're already in these positions of power, very little. What can we do all together? Anything. I mean,
Yeah.
we could really do anything. I mean, what do you want? You want universal health care? You want free college? You want, like, what is it? Like, if we all do it together, sky's the limit. But the fewer and fewer people we get to whatever it is that we're trying to do, especially down to the individual, it's limited.
Yeah, I think that putting it in the context of also like the liberal and neoliberal lens is particularly interesting because the other day I was reading or watching or somehow I heard this quote coming from a voter here in the United States that was saying, something along paraphrasing here very loosely, but something along the lines of like, we're doing what we're doing and advocating for the things that we're advocating for because the media has lied to us, because our politicians have lied to us, because the system has lied to us. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is such a good and powerful quote. This is right. I mean, of course,
Mhm.
you've been institutionally manipulated, if you want to put it that way. And then I was like, wow, this person must be such a great free thinking advocate. And then it was like some huge Trump supporter, and it was a post
Spoiler
on
alert.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was a post on whatever his website's called Truth Social. And I was like,
Mhm.
wow, okay, this is interesting, and it's
Yeah.
it's I say cool, and I don't know if that's nihilistic or I don't know what you might want to assume about me if I say cool, but I think it is in a very absurd way, a little cool that the system that we've created is so there's so many innate contradictions in it that
Mhm.
you can exist in the exact same system as someone else in the exact same area, suffer very similar, consequences of upbringing. And your perspective can be that we're waiting for this white messiah to come and save us, and that everyone else, in the world is bad, and that this land is the thing that matters the most, and this identity that you possess is the thing that matters the most. And then you can also be on the opposite side of that, like someone like yourself is, where it's kind of just like, well, yeah, everything's lying to us, and that's kind of just part of how the system works, and the issue is the system. And then someone's like, no, it's not the system, it's how we're doing the system. The system's great, it works great.
Sure. It's the lie part, right? I mean, there's a neoliberal sort of impetus under the notion that it's a lie, which would imply some individual or cabal of individuals are manipulating us in a very conspiratorial kind of way,
Sure.
versus like all society is a lie, right? If by lie you mean there's no natural existence for this thing, there's no scientific justification for it, and that we are interpolated into human beings to believe that it is, then yeah, everything is a lie. Sure, that doesn't make it bad. I mean, yeah, when I teach about social justice, and I have to say, like, you should care about this thing, that's kind of a lie. That's an indoctrination. I'm trying to bring you in. God, if this gets the Fox News, I'm done. But I'm trying to bring you in to this. I know, right? To this reality, right? Now, I just happen to think that particular lie is good, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that I think the lie that coffee is great is good, or that Kendrick Lamar won the Drake battle is good. Like, I mean, those are lies in the sense that I can't justify them. In a scientifically rational kind of way. But I think they're good, right? So there's that part of it. And I have a soft spot for Trump people. I have a soft spot for them. Because I understand what it's like to be enmeshed in reality where it looks like everything is just falling apart. And you're being told that it's this person over here, right? I get that, and I get that from a liberal angle. Like, I get that from the understanding, like, of Democrats, that you're being told your reality is crumble, and it's Donald Trump. And it's like, Trump is one cog in a much broader machinery in which our Democratic politicians participate, right? And benefit from, and help keep alive, right? They maintain, they facilitate. So I understand, it makes sense to me. It's a rational feeling. And then to be able, the kind of cognitive dissonance, to be able to say, it's not white people, right? Because that's the way in which our liberal understandings of race really work. We'd say, it's not white people. It's maybe like this history of white people or whatever else. But you, as a white person, voting democratically, sending your kids to private school, living in the suburbs, shopping at Whole Foods, you're good to go because you buy GMO organic foods. So you're fine. It's Trump, right? And his supporters, they're the problem. So I understand their frustration. I understand their positionality. I can't sympathize with it because it feels really violently volatile and violent towards me and as an individual, but I can empathize with it. I can understand it. If you are told constantly that the reason why you lost your job is because there are illegals crossing the border, and then you're told, hey, they're going to try and tell you otherwise. They're going to use science that way, but like, no. Science is a problem, then where do you turn? Yeah, okay, well, it's got to be adrenochrome. It's got to be, Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate, and right, like there's nowhere else to go. It's got to be that they're taking these babies and extracting hormones from them so that they can live forever, right? So it makes sense to me, right? Now, of course, I'm not going to take a vaccine. Science is wrong. They told me that. And so then it's got to be that they're actually injecting microchips into me so they can keep track of me,
That's making it on Fox News.
Right? Oh, that's going.
That's going to be the
right. But maybe it'll be supportive. They'll be like,
no, it will
sociologist backs up our claim that the government is tracking you through vaccines. It's like, and at the same time, like the vaccine is such a good example because as a Black person, when they were like, hey, vaccine and it's new and we haven't, we've tested it as way we go, but we really, we cleared some hurdles to do it quickly. Tuskegee came to my mind.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And the way in which, or the general way in which like the medical establishment has historically misused and abused Black people, especially Black women, and the history of gynecology and the Hottentot Venus and over, right? And so just like you, Trump supporter, I am also really critical of this notion, right? So you're right. It's interesting to see how we can take one system that physically should have one truth, one describable reality, but take very different perspectives to get to that same describable reality. Perspectives that are themselves in a lot of ways contradictory, right?
Yeah.
But in that way, it's if lie means socially constructed, then sure, it's all a lie. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad.
It's funny because doing these interviews for the past couple years now, I've always had some pride in the fact that we're able to do a very in-depth dive into our guests and find a lot of information about them that they didn't even know was available, or that they didn't know was out there. There's nothing on you. I mean, like your social media presence, all of these things. You're very, very low key person. One thing that I did just know from conversing is that you are from Georgia. You've mentioned that before, and that the South plays a very key role in your identity, among other things.
Sure.
Why? Why do you care about the South so much?
Oh, God. That's a good question. Well, let me correct. I mean, I moved here from Atlanta, but I grew up in Charlotte.
Okay.
And was born in New York, but I grew up in Charlotte, so still the South. I would actually say Charlotte is more the South than Atlanta in my mind.
Ooh. That's crazy.
I know, it's weird, but when I go back and visit, I'm like, damn, this is like the South. And I didn't really feel that way in Atlanta, really. I mean,
I see what you're saying.
Outside of ITP, and but the South for me, I have an odd relationship with it. It was growing up in the South was growing up in a southern city. Yeah. I don't think it's the South so much as like urban southernness is really what's interesting to me, because it's such a contradiction of terms in a lot of ways. Charlotte is a really good example. I mean, I remember after 9/11, and I was in high school, and things were all, I don't know the age of your listeners, but they may not know this, but everybody was really, really anxious and really, really tense. And people who were like, had never watched the news before were like watching it 24/7, for example, and scared. There was fear to go. I mean, just people like, it was like the beginning of the pandemic. Why is all the toilet paper gone? We don't know. We're just buying toilet paper, So there was this fear that Charlotte would be one of the targets if it was to happen again quickly. And why would it happen again quickly? We don't know, but that's just what we're talking about. But there was this ongoing fear, like, oh, they're gonna bomb another city, and it's going to happen in like the next week or something. And Charlotte was at one of the top places on that list. And the idea was because it was like the center of banking at the time, which still is to some degree. It's the headquarters of Bank of America. And I think another bank, which is defunct maybe. But I remember being like, really, Charlotte? Like I'm in high school. Why in the hell would they care about, Charlotte? So there's this like paradox of urban southernness, of like at the same time, this sort of same importance that we give to like metropolitan or cosmopolitan areas, but also like not. It's this, and I don't think I think Atlanta is a exception. I think it's an exception to this kind of rule. I don't feel that same paradox in Atlanta that I feel in like Birmingham or Tampa, or even New Orleans. It doesn't give me the same. Atlanta just feels like a city. It doesn't feel like a Southern place to me, other than the heat, But these other places feel really like they're on this precipice of like not knowing what they want to do, like they're conflicted. I don't know if you ever listen to or follow like any of Julio Torres's work. He has like HBO shows and a special, but his shtick, he's a comedian, kind of like this existential comedian, but his shtick is about like how objects or colors or ideas have like feelings. He like anthropomorphizes them. So he'll say like orange makes this kind of face, and it's interesting. And that's kind of how I feel about like Southern cities. Like they're trying to decide where they want to be, and they're coming up in like really weird ways. And so like I remember growing up in Charlotte, and Charlotte used to have like this downtown after 5 like concert series or something, and there'd be really crowded and there'd be lots of people. And the musical acts that they would invite were just so interesting and so exemplary of this indecision. So like they would have like 3 Doors Down, for example, which I don't even know if people of your generation know who 3 Doors Down, who that is. Do you have any idea who that is?
I'm not a good example because I feel like I don't have an idea of what anything is. Like, to be completely honest, people are like, "Have you seen this show?" I'm like, "No."
Well, I mean, they were kind of big at the time,
sure,
but they really straddle this line between like alt rock and country in a really interesting kind of way. And like, so it's kind of like that, and it's. I feel it, and maybe that's how I feel, and maybe the reflection of that is in my subjectivity and my own understanding of self, that I feel kind of torn between, this sort of, I don't know, bucolic, pastoral, old timey, I don't know, Southern heat and iced tea and whatever else, and also this like, we're going to a queer art show and we're taking the subway and we're going to stop by this new, restaurant that is like Korean tacos that are on top of pizzas that are rolled into bagels. And, so it's like this, maybe that's how I feel. Maybe that's the expression, but I really can't say. I don't know why it has such a huge impact over my selfhood, but it does feel really important.
Yeah, no, and I wanted to talk about the American South in specific just because I guess it really first came into perspective, actually, full circle here, when I got to travel up north a little bit more, and I got to experience northern cities. I really hadn't been across the Mississippi till I was, I guess, like 17, 18. And that's like point blank period. That's anywhere in the world geographically. I had not, gone. Or the Mason-Dixon, not the Mississippi. Jesus Christ, Mason-Dixon. I didn't get above the Mason-Dixon. And when I finally did, I guess I started to look at the South in a very different way, and it was super interesting. A couple weeks ago, I had the opportunity to bring my partner to my hometown, and she had gone before, but she hadn't really got a lot of time to spend and to actually do the things that are associated with the city that I'm from. And the city that I'm from has a super antiquated racist past. I mean, we only got rid of our lynching tree less than half a decade ago. And the plaque that replaced it commemorating the person that was lynched was vandalized several times. Like, this is still a town that has we founded the KKK in Georgia. Like, this is a very, very strong, antiquated, I guess is the best way to put it, town. And it's very interesting because she brought it to my attention that the town itself is having this sort of conflict. So we have different city centers now. We have different like little urban developments, and that's her thing. She's really into urban planning and like sustainability and all of that. And she's like, it's really cool. You guys have like living, learning, 15-minute walkable cities that no one else, nowhere else in the US do you really have that. And I feel like that might be specific to the area that I am in right now, because it's one of those like very quickly developing areas that's economically just skyrocketed in the past couple of years. So you get this mesh of like the southern with the new like developer. So it's really, that conflict is really apparent there. And you watch this guy in cowboy boots, you know, getting a poke bowl. And like, you know, he has like the South will rise again belt buckle, and he's wearing a cowboy hat, like drinking like a margarita, you know,
eating
and
sushi, pumpkin
Um,
spice latte.
but I think there's a larger theme there in the South where it the way that I try to describe it was it has that communal aspect that a lot of people that want the social justice change that some argue is necessary in the world, they have that. They care about their neighbors. If they hear something going on, they'll go and check on you. And they're, of course, racist. They say bad things, they say bigoted things. But at the end of the day, if you're one of their Mexican or Black friends, you're one of their Mexican or Black friends. Like they will stand up for you. It's always they're one of the good ones. Conversation to be had. And that's something that I think is often critiqued in society, but isn't really understood or observed or like tried to no one really tries to empathize with it. Where it's kind of like this visceral hate that drives a lot of their worldview isn't actually even there. They don't actually even have that. Because if they did, then this relationship would be impossible. And I feel like there's so many interesting contradictions that have historically been in place in the South that have to do with these things, whether it be something as, difficult and gross as a slave master loving the slave, where there's this humanistic idea where it's, oh, okay, like I actually do just, like this other person for whatever reason, but there's still something that's harming the way that this relationship could really be were this, societal structure not in the way. Are there do you notice those larger themes in the South?
Yeah, I do. And growing up in Charlotte, I experienced those, white folks who would claim me as a friend, but also say very explicitly racist things,
Yeah.
And I think that's part and parcel of just how white supremacy works. I mean, it's impossible to discount millions of people as the same. Like there's no cognitive way to do that.
Yeah.
To justify it. So I mean, there are always these relationships or whatever else that sort of bubble up that seem to sort of contradict that. Or not even just relationships, but like even if you think about minstrel and Jim Crow and blackface, and it seems sort of paradoxical and ironic that at the same time that white supremacy has such antipathy towards Black people to lynch them en masse, but also want to go see Blackness displayed on a stage by white people is a very strange thing. But I think it's just part of how white supremacy is self-justifying. And I think that's particularly in terms of ways in which we can legitimize our own particular attitudes and experiences. The idea that, white supremacy it needs to be flexible. It can't, systems of oppression can't just relegate everyone to one status, because that would not be maintainable. So instead we can say, okay, I'm not a racist because this Black person I'm cool with, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a sexist because I don't act that way towards my mother or whatever else.
Sure.
So I think it's just problematic really to look to make an assessment about systems of oppression through individual relationships, because we'll just never get that really, right? I mean, And it's the same sort of way if you think about like the way that the successes of individual Black people are often used to sort of suggest that white supremacy is no longer important, right? That we have Black Supreme Court justices, two of them now. So we don't only talk about white supremacy, but obviously, I mean, just looking at Clarence Thomas in general and Clarence Thomas as a human being and Clarence Thomas's wife's text messages and whatever else, that cannot be emblematic of racial justice.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we'll have to take a structural perspective in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I think the South in particular, and we don't want to give credence to the whole idea that the South is somehow more racist or whatever than other places.
No.
But it is certainly more interesting to see the ways in which places that have not urbanized as quickly or in like the place you're describing or in currently urbanizing, how they deal with the sort of at least the liberal rhetoric of urbanized places being more racially just or more sexually just or whatever else, what that means.
Yeah.
Eventually, I think there'll be sort of epicenters of really the exemplifying the problematic of thinking about systems in terms of individual relations. That the South will rise again guy belt buckle, for example, the fact that he's eating sushi does not mean that he didn't have racist things to say about Chinese Americans during the pandemic, for example. Right?
Yeah. No, and it's also like he totally doesn't have like an American flag on the back of his truck. Talking about the South will rise again.
Sure.
But no, right. You were saying how you can't say that people in the South are more racist. I think that it's interesting, right? I obviously want to stay away from generalizations, but as I was saying earlier, it's almost as though they say more racist things and act more outwardly racist. But at the end of the day, I feel like they're closer to being not racist than like a Joe Biden Democrat is.
Sure.
Or like a northern Joe Biden Democrat, because like to a certain level for them, it's obviously something that is ingrained in them and a part of their personality, but it's almost surface level. It's almost surface level, racism, and it's almost like if they were to experience just literally a little bit more, an ounce more of something semi-differently, they would feel differently, have different attitudes towards the people around them. But like a liberal will like go to, a northern liberal here will go to like Africa and like do good things for people of color and then be like, wow, I did good things for like the Black man. I helped him so much. Yes, yeah, right. And it's like, okay, well, like that's not racist, but you are being helpful, but you're not being helpful. And it's like, I feel like it's a lot more difficult for someone who is bigoted but doesn't recognize it than someone who, like, if you go to them and you go, you're a bigot, they go, what's a bigot? I know I'm a bigot. What are you? It's different. It's different attitudes. Do you think that the South, for that reason, is particularly primed for like a sociological revolution? However, whatever you might take that to be.
Well, I will say that in my experience in the South, there is this preponderance of grassroots racial justice, gender justice, sexual justice, all these different kinds of grassroots organizations that are really critical of the sort of nonprofit industrial complex that I think dominates a lot of the ways in which that same kind of activity is taking place in more urban areas, or more northern areas. And as a social justice scholar, I appreciate that. So I think the South is ripe for that kind of revolution. And honestly, it will probably happen there. I do think there's something, I don't know if surface level is the right term, but I think there's something to Southern racism that on its face feels particularly changeable.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah,
it's like it's transformable in a way that a kind of liberal, urban, non-racist racism doesn't feel, because it feels very institutionalized.
Yeah, that's a good
Like
way to put it.
it's a lot easier for me to say, hey, saying that all, I don't know, that all Mexican immigrants are rapists
Yeah.
is a racist thing. Here's how. Like one, two, three.
Yeah.
Boom.
Yeah.
Like it's
Yeah.
like here it is.
Yeah.
But then to be able to say, hey, sending your kids to a private school is racist. That's a way bigger
Yeah.
conversation,
Yeah.
and I have to talk about, like, the charter school movement and the private school movements. And yeah, Montessori's look really great, but how is it that they're replicating the same gentrification processes and displacement processes? How is it that when you pull your kids out of public school, it's also this like mechanism of white flight, and it means that you are decreasing the sort of tax monies that would go into public schools that are servicing minority kids that need iPads in classroom or SAT tutoring more so than those private schools in the suburbs or whatever else. Hey, yeah, you want a bigger house for your family to grow into or whatever else, but as you move, you're also changing the momentum and flow of capital and resource, and governments will take their monies and corporations will take their interest in the monies away from those public urban areas where people of color are and move them towards the suburbs, and that'll be a problem. That's a whole thing. That's like four or five volumes of really, intricate, complex kind of ways that we collectively don't really describe as racist, right? We
Mhm.
have such a personalized discrimination slash prejudice understanding of racist that when we say something is racist, that's what we think. This individual is doing something wrong to that individual. We almost never it's very difficult for us to think about racist processes and how those processes are so often post-civil rights movement liberal. They're embedded
Yeah.
in liberal mechanics, like Whole Foods, for
Mhm.
example. I don't know why I keep going back to Whole Foods, but Amazon,
Yeah.
the ways in which these things are working are racist endeavors, they're racist processes, they're white supremacist processes, to be more specific. And that means something, right? If you're more okay with Biden closing the border than Trump, we didn't fix anything.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, Biden's order is doing the same thing as Trump's. He just didn't call them shithole countries. I'm not sure that is really that different, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, some social justice scholars argue that liberal rhetoric, the being able to like, to push all of that white supremacist statist kind of stuff under a liberal rhetoric actually makes us less able to critique it and therefore can make it more dangerous. It's easier to point to Trump and say that's terrible than to do so with Biden or the Democrats. And that, in a way, can be a more dangerous kind of thing because the people with power, right? One of the things about Southern whites is that they're disproportionately poor,
Yeah.
right, than the northern whites. And so there's a kind of capitalist power, notwithstanding the sort of, what Du Bois calls the psychological wage of whiteness, but the material reality of capital is absent then. So the real power structure, in a lot of ways, is with the white liberals that have money,
Yeah.
right? And if we can't critique them, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, no, it's super. That's what I was trying to get at earlier too. It's almost like I've had this question. I haven't really found a good way to answer it, and I'm sure that I'll struggle with it for decades if afforded the opportunity. But it's almost like is it a structural barrier to realization? Is it a biological barrier to realization? Like a lot of people say that my generation, we were having the conversation about like the mental health issues that afflict my generation, and people throw that out there like it's just something in the water or like something that like genetically was predetermined that like my generation just for whatever reason was going to have more anxiety or depression or this, that, and the other, and it's totally nothing else other than that could possibly be causing it.
Sure.
um it is there like what's the hope here? I'm a big language person. I'm a big, a rhetoric and discourse person, and I think that there something that caught my attention that you discussed previously was um, power and discourse, and like this knowledge power dynamic, that
Mhm.
Foucault presents, um,
Mhm.
talking about how maybe we don't even have the words in our
Mhm.
language to be able to articulate
Yeah.
the things that we want. But even beyond that, it's not even if we have the denotation for a word, but it's the connotation that's often,
Mhm.
associated with it. The performance that comes alongside a term is often more, if not just as, or just as, if not more important than the term itself. Um, and that gets me thinking about this conversation that we might have of white supremacy or hetero supremacy. Um, is there, or again, it becomes paradoxical. Are we
Mhm.
somehow assisting the structure that maintains these oppressive forces by using the language of the oppressive structure itself?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
is there a way to get language that isn't produced via this structure, or is it just impossible?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question. And it's
Sure.
it's it's the question of it's the question of absolutes. It's the rhetorical philosophical quandary of saying, well, nothing is absolute, but then you use an absolute
Mm,
by saying nothing is
yeah.
absolute, right? So it's well, first let me address the mental illness part. I mean, 'cause I see that too, and it really irks me. And I'll tell you this. I will think about autism in particular because this is where I know about the research. And one of the ways in which, and going back to vaccines, one of the ways in which the sort of anti-vaccine movement was operating was by saying how vaccines cause autism.
Yeah.
Now, there's no evidence to suggest that, but to think about the increase of the diagnosis of autism, it's important to think about diagnosis. People really just focus on the autism part, or to think about the increase of depressive or anxious disorders. People just think about depression or anxiety and not the diagnosis of it. And so, what we know, for example, with autism is that we've increased the diagnosis, but it doesn't necessarily mean that more people are on the spectrum. Right.
Mm,
And in fact, the evidence is to the contrary. There's probably not more people, but we have um, been better at defining the diagnosis, and we've been slowly, for some communities, making diagnoses more accessible. So that yeah, you're going to see an increase, right? And one of the things that we've been doing, at least I know in the '90s, it was like boys were being diagnosed left and right with things like ADHD, but girls almost never. And
mhm.
we were just thinking that like those same symptoms that we saw in boys, we just sort of like naturalized in girls, right? And now we're coming back and saying, oh shit, actually, girls also have
Yeah.
ADHD,
Yeah.
and so and that gets back to your point about like language and rhetoric and discourse and how powerful it really is. We're just accepting, for example, even with heart disease. There's research here on heart disease. There was this belief really in like the '80s and the '70s that in the early '90s that women almost never suffered from heart disease, or at least did so in like really disproportionate ways to men. And it
Yeah.
turns out we were just all of our medical diagnosis like criteria was based on studies done on men, right? So there's this. We were accepting this thing as biological and physiological, what women are literally suffering and dying. We didn't realize that different bodies will experience symptoms differently, right?
Yeah.
So discourse is super powerful, and it's that discourse precedes the power and the biological assignment or whatever else, and not the opposite way around. That gets people really tense, and really it's difficult, I think, for lots of folks to understand. But to your second question, is it possible to produce a language that has not yet been produced?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Imagine a color that you can't imagine.
Exactly. I don't know. I think cosmologically, in terms of like the nature of the universe, in a lot of ways, things two answers. Observably, it would appear that things precede other things. In other words, that once the universe gets going, everything inside of it is going to proceed from something that precedes it. So the idea that some concept or discourse or language could just sort of like emerge without being produced by something that came before it, I don't know. At the same time, the Big Bang, right?
Yeah.
And so, the arguments behind the Big Bang, and people are critical, and it's really difficult for us as humans to like say, how did something come out of nothing, right? But like, astrophysics and cosmology suggests that the notion that something must proceed from something else is really not a physical reality. It's not a physical law. It's not physically impossible for something to emerge from nothing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a both and. In a way, I'm contradicting myself because I'm suggesting that we can look towards physical law to try to understand human realities, which I think maybe 10 minutes ago I said was the wrong way to do
Sure.
so it's complicated. It's so complex. I mean, it's my feeling based on what I understand and feel from my studies of social justice and sociological theory, et cetera, is no. It's not possible for something of the human condition to come out of nowhere. I think instead, the kind of change that I think you're suggesting through your question happens through smaller changes, right? And we can see that. I think we have a historical record of the way that works, how feudalism gets transformed into capitalism, for example, right? Through, things like the hedge movement and, hey, that little piece of land where you let your cows go, I'm going to put some bushes around it. And it's mine now. And if you want to use it, you're going to pay me, blah, right? So, and I'm sure the serfs at the time are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, how are you just going to like own a piece of land? Like, that makes no sense. Now we just have deeds. Like, it's just a regular thing that we don't question. So I think it's smaller. It's this transitionary thing where the attitudes, the ideas, the activities change a little bit, person to person, activity to activity, era to era, community to community, till you get something that in a kind of hindsight looks dramatically different from where it started. But to say that it will just sort of pop into existence out of nowhere, I don't see that. I don't see any theoretical evidence that such a thing could happen. And I don't see any historical evidence that such a thing has happened. And to me, it seems like the entire discipline of history as an academic discipline, and perhaps archaeology as well, and maybe even anthropology, are built on the idea that, okay, we're going to trace this thing from this thing, and then that thing from that thing, and that thing from that thing. And that's really how I think transformative social change also happens. It's a neoliberal sense that gives us this notion of like instant revolution. Right? That one individual, one Martin Luther King will step up somewhere and say something, and then suddenly everybody's minds will be changed. And that's just not that's not how it happened. That could never happen. Martin Luther King had a whole army of Black women behind him who never got their due, who were doing all kinds of things behind the scenes, and really, he was the face of a movement that was far larger, far more strategic, far more communal than just this one guy, in the way that which we've sort of like rewritten history. Nelson Mandela, take your pick of these people, right? That we platform as individuals were really just pieces of a much broader machinery that has a trajectory that probably can be traced all the way back to the beginning of human civilization.
Yeah.
So I'll say no. I'll say probably not.
Probably not. There you go. That's a good answer. No, I think it is. I think it's also interesting, the development of this lycurgus that you're talking about. That's the term that I've been familiarized with. This lycurgus figure that comes in, sets up the law, says how things are, and then humbly retreats back to their farm to never be seen again. You know, like the Jimmy Carter of political activists. And no, it's also particularly interesting because it goes exactly into what we're saying in terms of the rhetoric and the language, where it's even when the rhetoric and the language is one way, it can be switched so quickly. Even when, you know, the rhetoric and the language in the 1960s was, look at this violent, you know, riot that Martin Luther King Jr. is leading, to look at this peaceful civil action. Then this is how we should do it, or the fact that even, you know, again, this is another question that I haven't answered, and I'm sure we could do a whole podcast on just nonviolence in and of itself. But even the fact that we promote Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi over figures like Malcolm X, or that we don't even really touch base on, you know, Nate Turner's slave rebellion, for the, you know, on the basis of like, hey, this is you know, like, the violence there cannot be justified because it was violence against violence, like it was self-defense. There's not an analytical discourse, I think, of what's actually occurring in a lot of social justice movements across the world. Like, again, even with Dr. King, like you're mentioning, it is almost this messiah-like figure that comes. They come from the pulpit, and they definitely treated their wife well the whole time that they were, you know, together, and there was no ulterior motive or underlying, you know, remarks being said when he wanted white children playing in his backyard. But it's I don't know, these superstructures that we built, and I think that this is the perfect transition just for the last thing. I just want to see what you have to say on God and death. Was the last topic that we had written down. Yeah, right. I feel like started slow and
good exit music.
Yeah, right. Let's just answer all the questions that everyone's ever had. But yeah, what does this tell you? You know, this I don't even know what emotion to put on it. It's desperation, guilt, happiness, anxiety. I get this weird feeling, and I've written it down once, and I can't really, I don't even remember exactly what I said, but it's like, out of all of the things that, right, as a sociologist, we believe, like you said, that things are built on things that come before them, and that, you know, there's a social construction of reality that takes place. And I just, one day, I was like, if we could have done anything and built anything as a society together, how did we get here? Like, where did we go wrong? And I guess that's the perfect question on God and death. What did God do wrong? Why didn't he use all his power and mercy?
Well, I think there's two questions there, right? I mean, I think the one question that maybe you're trying not to ask is like, what is the sociological take on gods? And then the other question, I think, is about like the evolution of human societies, and if we could have, if all possibilities were open to us in the beginning, how did we manage to create this, right?
Yeah.
So I'll start with your second one, and then we'll end on the first one. So in terms of, you know, I think it depends on who you ask, to be honest. And I think, and I'm not saying that in a kind of, you know, I'm saying that in a way to say that there are probably good explanations about how we got here that are contradictory, yet probably equally theoretically valid.
Yeah.
So not to say that someone's just like making up some stuff that's self-serving, but my take in its basic form would be, in terms of like why it is that we came to a society that within itself is largely oppressive, would be our turn towards capitalism, our turn towards white supremacy, and our turn towards patriarchy. um, and that's not to say that other possibilities of oppression couldn't have emerged, right? It could have been that I don't know, we made a new caste system based on whatever, I don't know, fingernail length or something, and we'd be having this discussion now about fingernails or something, right? So not to say that, but to say that given what we see now, if I'm thinking about the historical lineage of how what we have now came into be and the problematics of this current social reality, I would trace it back to those larger three things. And I should also say that there are connected structural problems to those that also need to be addressed. Ableism, for example, the creation of the state, and the sort of the violence of maintaining those kinds of boundaries that become more and more necessary, especially the more and more you think about the state as a kind of identity. So nationalism and patriotism and ethno-nationalism, all of those things, fascism become really problematic the more we think about the state as something that we own, that belongs to us, that needs to be protected, et cetera, from intruders and outsiders. Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think a euphoric society was always possible, and the history of how we got to here, looking at that history, the roadblocks to such a euphoric society come from those broader three issues. They created kind of problematic and then worked together to sustain it. So when I say, if we wanted, euphoric society, if we wanted a utopia, we got to get rid of those three things. I mean it, and to put it in a more practical sense, like if we're interested, let's say climate change, for example, has the trajectory of really changing everything for the worse, right? There will be no way to effectively prevent it without addressing those three things, right? What we'll get instead is a staggered sort of level of prevention or protection where rich folks have their moon base, and the rest of us are down here on the earth struggling under the weight of oppressive heat or whatever, right? So in terms of like saving the planet, in terms of like climate change, then we'll have to address white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy by definition. Now, to get to your second question, which is a much bigger question, what does sociology have to say about God? Sociology is a science, and there is no scientific evidence of a God. So in terms of interpolating God in a way in which it is used in the everyday, not much. That would be like, what does sociology have to say about the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus? And in that sense, not much. In the sense of the utility, the discourse of religion, lots, right? I mean, there's whole sociologies of religion, it's a whole section, there are textbooks, courses, et cetera. Much of that has to do with its utility, its usefulness as a discourse, to move people to motivate certain kinds of behaviors. And Durkheim, who was one of the progenitors, one of the big three of sociology, argued that every society has a religion. Every society must have a religion, he argued. And it does not have to do anything with God, or gods or whatever else. But for Durkheim, every society has to have something that it worships. For some societies, that'll be something religious. For some societies, that'll be what we call a civil religion. So like we're worshiping the state itself, America first, blah, 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 Soviet, Russia.
Could there be a monetary
Germany.
worship?
Absolutely. Anything. From Durkheim, anything is possible, right? And I think there are some modern contemporary sociologists who talk about like sports, football, both American and European, as like a kind of religious orientation, right? So for Durkheim, like societies have to stay together. And the way that they stay together is that they get united in a kind of upstanding something as sacred and untouchable. And historically, that has been a god. Increasingly, we can think about that as like finance, money, sport, whatever, the state itself. So, and in that way, sociology really, I think, destabilizes the notion that some supernatural entity is in charge of structuring and facilitating our social realities. Because there's no scientific evidence for such a thing, we really don't enter such a thing into our analyses. And on a personal note, if such a thing exists, is it really worth all the talk and hubbub? I mean, what are they doing? What are they doing to like childhood cancer? It's like, what's the deal? Like, explain that to me.
Yeah.
But that's a personal thing. That's neither here nor there.
Yeah, well, it's mysterious. It's mysterious ways of doing work,
Yeah, and super mysterious
Yeah,
too.
it's really
and,
mysterious.
And that's what, when I was a kid and I would always, question just everything,
Yeah.
and my family's largely Southern Baptist, so pretty adamantly Protestant, and really did not like when I would ask questions. And I'm a kid, and these questions just seem very obvious to me, like, he's up there, God, and he's letting babies die? Why? And the response would be like, well, you can never know the mind of God. Lots of idioms or expressions, right?
Yeah.
You can't know the mind of God, or he has a plan for everyone. And it just was never satisfying to me. And it was like, okay, I guess. Like, I really like a little bit more explanation as to why this works. So sociology for me is a really easy fall into. Science in general was like, oh, I don't have to be thinking about that anymore. I can just say, boop, here it is. So in terms of death, I mean, what sociology says about death is for me is really interesting. I used to teach a class on death, and I've read a lot about the sociological takes on death because I find it very fascinating. And partly that's because it feels we understand it as such a bodily experience, as so corporal. And I love those kind of corporal experiences because they're the places where sociology gets really intricate and interesting. So to talk about death and dying as a sociological experience instead of a biological one, it's just so interesting to me. So what sociology says about it is that it's a social construction, right? And so even just saying death is a social construction gets people roused and they're ready to argue, right? And it's a difficult concept, I think, also to unpack and disentangle. That something so bodily and so normative that we will all die is a socially constructed thing. What exactly counts as death? Is it your last breath? Is it your last brain wave? What happens if your atoms and molecules are reintroduced into the environment, into something that's living? Are you alive again? Are you the bird and the flower and the plant and the paramecium? And so then we start thinking about, well, what does it mean to be alive? If you have a pacemaker or an implant or, nails in your knee, like, are you part robot? Are you all alive? Is some of you dead? Were you ever really all alive? So there's a lot of questions there that I think are just so interesting and really emblematize my love of sociology. Once we get to that space and like everything's just like it's this and it's that and it's this and it's that, that's where I get really excited. I think that's the really good, interesting, exciting things about sociology there. So the sociology of God and death, I think, is in that sort of manifest. It's in this way in which those notions get constructed and reconstructed, and what they really make us do and not do, right? And for me, I'm always thinking about social justice. So the ways in which, like, theistic ideas about life as sacred prevent us from being, really open, having really open discussions about, physician-assisted deaths and abortions and even suicidality in general. And it's very interesting to me, and it's a topic that we need to talk more about as sociologists, and implicate it in the ways in which we're doing, social justice projects.
Yeah, no. And that's something that, if the opportunity presents itself, I'd love to have you back on the show to be able to discuss. Now, one final question here for you. I have a friend that he would always tell me, now this is just for context, he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was a Protestant and then a Catholic, and he traveled to different places, and he was a very, very staunch conservative, like a Bush era conservative. And we were very good friends. We talked all the time. He told me one thing. He said, Damian, for the type of change that you want to see in this world, I have to die first. And I always said, you're probably right. What do you think about that idea that for change to happen, the old has to go and the new has to come?
I disagree. I think every generation has a new iteration of problematics. I don't think it's a generationally era thing. It's funny that the old saying of like, young people are liberal and then they age into conservatism. And I was just reading, not even that long ago, research, and it was like, no, it's just that the liberals die younger. Right? They have less money, they have less, they're largely people of color, et cetera, less money, less access to healthcare. They're dying younger. So you're seeing what this is just really a pattern that isn't really representative of some sort of like age relatedness to like problematics or oppression or whatever else, right? So, I don't think so. I think, and to go back to your question about violence too, and it's not that revolution must be inherently violent or inherently nonviolent, right? Inherency is a problematic idea in sociology in general. The problem is like, what do we want? That's the faith-based jump, right? If we want a society that is free from violence, is it possible to create such a thing from violence? And that's the question that's not answered yet, because we won't address it, because we're just so wrapped up in nonviolent this, nonviolence that. The real question is like, okay, can a nonviolent thing proceed from a violent thing, right? That's the question we really should be focused on as social justice folks who are interested in it. And so for me, it's like, I would prefer, and I think the consequential society would be more benevolent if instead of having you die, you just came and joined forces with us. I think it would be much more effective and much more, I think we'd be more likely to get the kind of consequence that we want if instead of killing you, I changed your mind and you believed in social justice and transformative justice, and I don't really care if you like Bush or whatever else, if you can acknowledge that capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy are bad things that should go away. If a Republican candidate is the person that comes along tomorrow and says those things, I don't really care what political party you belong to. It's irrelevant. It's just serendipitous that the Republican Party has more outwardly aligned itself with those things. But that's neither here nor there. If you can go into that and say, oh, actually, it doesn't really matter because this is a settler colonialist society, and that settler colonialism shouldn't operate the federal government by definition, that's more where I'm interested in. And so I don't think you have to die for that to happen. I think I just need to find new ways to convince you, individually, culturally, discursively, institutionally, for you to understand that when someone else is suffering, your suffering is just around the corner. So if you're only interested in your individual well-being, here's the clue. Like, if I can hurt that person, I can hurt you too, right? If the police can victimize Black people the way that they do, they can victimize white folks. It's not, just ask white trans people, white people with disabilities. They know, they experience these levels of police violence. They get it, right? Intersectionality is so important in these kinds of conversations so that I can get you on board, right? Yeah. Do you like being maligned as a Southerner? Of course not, right? That's a terrible feeling. Yes, that's how Black people feel. That's how people with disabilities feel. That's how women feel. Like, I can get you in here by talking about and empathizing with your particular experience, because oppression is oppression. It has different roots. It has different avenues, but it's going to operate largely in the same way. And the characteristics of the oppressed community is largely arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the historical pattern is there, but the selection of it is arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right. So it really doesn't matter. You should be on board with us because you might be next.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a good way. That's a good quote. Fox might take that out of context, right? You should be on board with us because
you're next.
We're coming for
And
you.
there's like 50 of my faces flashing on the screen. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
No problem.
As long as they pay me, right, for the footage, that's all that matters. Of course, famously. Yeah. Well, with that being said, if there's anything that you would like to shout out, Professor, I would say social media, but like, as we've discovered, there's nothing really.
Yeah, I'm not anywhere. So
book.
You'll have to catch me here only.
Anything. There you go.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can go buy my book. It's like $1 billion. I wouldn't advise it.
Sure.
And it's too expensive but it's in a library if you're interested in gay porn.
There you go.
Check it out.
There you go. And that's something I was just to close off here. I did read your dissertation. It was very well done.
Oh, okay.
And that's something that I think for a second conversation in the future, again, there's a lot of things that can be dived into here. But no, being introduced, I appreciate you coming on. And to anyone listening to this, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Damian Galvan Show. If you want to keep up with anything that I'm doing or that the Ox Institute is doing, be sure to follow me on social media at the Damian Galvan. That's on Instagram, X, anywhere that you can find podcasts. And be sure to follow the Ox Institute by heading to oxinstitute.org. And again, Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Happy to.